He said yes before he even finished hearing the whole question, and I noticed that before I noticed anything else about him. It wasn't enthusiasm, and it wasn't warmth either. It was something faster than either of those, something automatic, almost like a reflex you'd see in a body, not a decision you'd expect from a mind. Someone asked him to cover a shift on his one free evening, and his mouth answered before his thoughts had even arrived at the question. Later that night, he sat in his car in the parking lot for a long time without turning the key. He wasn't tired from the extra hours of work. He was tired from a decision he never actually got to make, one that had already been made for him somewhere far below conscious thought. I've seen that same stillness in other people too, in different parking lots, different kitchens, different quiet hallways right after a phone call ends. There's a very specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from agreeing too much, from saying yes so often that the word stops meaning anything at all. And the strange part is, from the outside, this almost never looks like a problem worth mentioning. People call him easygoing, low maintenance, someone who never makes anything difficult for anyone else around him. They call him reliable, the person you can always count on no matter what the situation happens to be. But I kept wondering, watching him agree for the 4th time that same week, what happens to a person after the 10th time or the 100th time? Where does all of that quiet agreement actually go once it has been handed away so freely? He would probably tell you he doesn't mind any of it, and on most days he might even believe that himself. But there was one small moment, easy to miss, that stayed with me far longer than it should have. Someone asked him, almost casually, what he wanted for dinner that night, and he simply froze in place. Not because the question was difficult in any real sense, because nobody had asked him that in a long while, and he genuinely no longer knew how to answer it. That's the detail that unsettled me the most, if I'm honest about it. Not the yes itself, which came so easily and so often. The silence sitting quietly underneath it, waiting there like it had been waiting for years. The stronger he looked from the outside, saying yes to everyone, holding every commitment together at once, the more quietly depleted he became somewhere nobody else could see. If this were simply kindness, the way people assumed it was, it would probably feel light. It would feel like giving something away and having plenty left over afterward. But this never felt like giving, not even once, not even quietly. It felt more like paying off a debt he didn't remember ever agreeing to take on in the first place. So I started asking myself a slightly different question about all of this. If this response isn't really a conscious choice, if it happens faster than any thought could travel, then where did it actually begin? Not in this job, and not in this particular relationship, and not in this one exhausting week. Somewhere much earlier than any of that, long before he had the vocabulary to describe what was happening to him. Somewhere the pattern had already been written, quietly, before he even understood what a boundary was supposed to be. Think for a moment about a child growing up in a house where love wasn't loud, but conditions on that love were always present. Not cruel conditions, and not always obvious ones either, at least not to an outside observer. Sometimes it was just a certain quiet that settled in the room after the child said no to something small. A parent who never raised their voice, but withdrew instead, leaving a silence that lingered a little too long. The child learns quickly from moments like these, far more quickly than adults tend to give children credit for. Not through any lecture, but through pattern recognition, the same way any developing brain learns to survive inside its particular environment. Saying no, even about something small, led to distance and a coldness that felt unbearable. Agreeing, on the other hand, led to warmth returning almost immediately, like a light switching back on. And a brain that is still forming its most basic connections doesn't calculate long-term cost the way an adult mind eventually learns to do.
It calculates immediate safety, right now, in this exact moment, and nothing further beyond that. So it made a decision quietly, almost permanently, long before language could ever describe what had actually happened inside it. Compliance came to equal connection, somewhere deep in that wiring. Disagreement came to equal danger, in a way that felt every bit as real as physical danger might. Nobody sat him down and explicitly taught him any of this, of course. Nobody ever really needs to sit a child down and explain any of this out loud. The nervous system does all of that teaching on its own, quietly, in the background. It works the way it always has, the way it does for any child trying to stay close to the people who keep them alive. And that's the part of this story that matters most. This was never weakness, and it was never some flaw picked out of nowhere by chance. It was adaptation, plain and simple. A brain doing exactly what brains are built to do under pressure. It was protecting the child from the one thing it feared above everything else, losing connection to the people it depended on completely. The tragedy isn't that this happened to him or to so many other people just like him. The tragedy is that the adaptation never came with an expiration date attached to it. It just kept running quietly, decades later, in situations that were no longer dangerous in any real sense at all. A coworker asking for a small favor is nothing like a parent withdrawing love from a frightened child. But the nervous system doesn't always know the difference between the two, especially when both situations trigger the exact same old alarm. It reacts the way it was trained to react long ago, because that training happened well before reasoning ever got a seat at the table. So now, watching him agree to work through that weekend again, I wasn't really seeing a grown man making a free choice. I was seeing a much younger version of him, still quietly trying to stay safe inside a house that no longer exists anywhere but memory. And once I started seeing it that way, I honestly couldn't stop noticing it everywhere I looked. A meeting, perfectly ordinary, nothing dramatic about it on the surface. Someone suggests an idea that clearly won't work, and he agrees with it anyway, nodding along like it makes perfect sense. Not because he's actually convinced by the logic of it, because disagreeing, even gently and even respectfully, feels like a risk his body simply isn't willing to take right now. I watched his shoulders tighten slightly, just a fraction, right before he nodded his agreement. That tightening came first, arriving faster than any conscious thought ever could. The agreement came second, almost as an afterthought his body had already decided for him. A phone call arrives later that same week, ordinary in every way except for its timing. A friend asks him to help move apartments on the one single weekend he'd finally planned to rest properly. He says, of course, immediately and warmly, as though it was never really a question that needed weighing. Then he hangs up the phone and stares at the wall for a moment longer than the situation really requires. You may recognize that particular stare if you've ever caught yourself doing it. Not sadness exactly, nothing quite that dramatic or that clear. Something closer to a quiet, private grief for a rest that just silently disappeared from the calendar. A dinner with family follows soon after, and a comment gets made carelessly by someone who genuinely didn't mean any harm by it. He absorbs it without flinching, laughs along easily, changes the subject before anyone notices anything. Later, completely alone, that same comment replays in his mind for hours on end, but never once out loud, and never once to the person who actually said it. A text message arrives late one night, an ask disguised carefully as a simple question, an obligation dressed up neatly as a small favor between friends. He answers within a single minute, already quietly rearranging his own plans to make room for someone else's needs instead. There was one more moment too, smaller than the others, easy to miss if you weren't already looking for it. A group chat, buzzing with plans for the weekend, everyone already assuming he'd be there without ever actually asking him. He typed out a message explaining he had other plans, then deleted it, then typed yes instead, all within about 30 seconds.
I started to notice that these situations weren't really separate stories happening by coincidence anymore. Each one echoed the last, wearing a slightly different outfit but carrying the exact same shape underneath it. You have probably felt some version of this yourself at some point, in your own life, in your own rooms. Not because you're passive by nature, and certainly not because you lack real opinions of your own. Because somewhere along the way, disagreement got quietly filed away as dangerous, while agreement got filed away as the only reliably safe option available. Once you see this pattern clearly, it becomes genuinely difficult to unsee it again. The meeting, the phone call, the dinner table, the late-night text message, they all start to look identical underneath. The exact same nervous system solving the exact same old problem in the exact same practiced way it always has. This is the point where it stops being a handful of unrelated moments scattered across a week. This is the point where it becomes something closer to a mechanism running quietly underneath everything else. The brain isn't reacting to each individual event on its own merits anymore. It built a shortcut a long time ago, back when the stakes were genuinely different, and now it simply runs that shortcut every single time, without asking anyone's permission first. Someone disagrees with you about something, and you feel a small flicker of tension rise somewhere in your chest. Instead of expressing that tension out loud, you swallow it quietly, because swallowing it once felt so much safer than letting it out ever did. And here is the part that keeps this entire cycle spinning long after it should have stopped. Every single time you swallow it and nothing terrible actually happens as a result, your brain doesn't conclude that speaking up might have been perfectly fine after all. It concludes instead that swallowing it worked, that the strategy succeeded once again, exactly as it was designed to. So it reinforces that exact same response a little more deeply, a little faster, a little more automatically than it did the time before. Each yes strengthens the very pathway that produced it in the first place. Each avoided conflict makes the next avoided conflict just a little more likely to happen without any real thought involved. This is precisely how a temporary childhood survival strategy slowly turns into a permanent adult identity that people build their whole lives around. Not because you're weak in any meaningful sense of that word, because your brain, in its own strange and stubborn logic, genuinely believes it is still protecting you from something. And slowly, without any single dramatic turning point you could point back to, your entire life starts quietly shrinking around this one shortcut. You stop applying for opportunities you might not get, because the possibility of rejection has become almost unbearable to sit with. You stop stating your own preferences out loud, because even a small preference might create frictions somewhere you'd rather avoid. You stop taking up space in conversations, in relationships, in decisions that were technically always yours to make. Not all at once, and not in any way you could easily point to and name. One quiet accommodation at a time, until one day you look around and barely recognize the shape of the life you're actually living inside of. But here's something worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. Maybe the problem was never really who you are as a person, deep down. Maybe it's simply a brain that learned, a very long time ago, that shrinking itself was the safest possible way to stay loved by the people around it. That isn't a character flaw you were born with. That's a survival strategy that quietly overstayed its welcome long after the danger it was designed for had already passed. And strategies, unlike identities, can actually be updated, rewritten, revised over time with enough patient practice. This isn't about suddenly becoming someone who says no to absolutely everything all at once out of nowhere. That would just be trading one extreme for another one, equally exhausting in its own way. It's smaller than that, and somehow it's harder than that too, in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. It's noticing the exact moment your body wants to say yes automatically, and pausing there, just a second or two longer than usual. That pause is where almost everything actually starts to change, quietly, without any fanfare.
not in some big dramatic confrontation you've been dreading for years, in the tiny gap between the question being asked and the reflex answering it before you're ready. In that small gap, a strange and unfamiliar thing suddenly becomes possible again.
You get to ask yourself a question that nobody ever really asked you as a child. What do I actually want here, in this exact moment, for myself? Not what keeps the peace in the room, not what avoids disappointing the person standing in front of you. What do I actually want underneath all of that conditioning? The first few times you try asking this, the answer might not come easily at all. That's not failure on your part. That's simply an unused muscle slowly remembering how to move again after years of stillness. And something genuinely shifts once you start asking it, even quietly, even privately, even when no one else can hear you. A boundary doesn't have to be loud in order to be completely real. It doesn't have to sound like a speech or a confrontation or some grand declaration of independence. Sometimes it sounds like, "Let me think about it and get back to you tomorrow." That single sentence alone is enough to interrupt a pattern that took years and years to build so carefully. It buys you the one thing the pattern was never designed to allow: a little space between the ask and the answer. In that space, you're no longer the child in the quiet house, even if it doesn't feel that way at first. You're just a person, standing in a room, deciding what you actually want to do next. You don't need to dismantle the whole structure all at once in one single overwhelming attempt. You just need to stop feeding it, one small moment at a time, patiently, without judging yourself along the way. And slowly, gradually, the response itself starts to change on its own. Not because the underlying fear disappears completely, because it rarely disappears completely for anyone, but because you start proving to your own nervous system, through small, repeated moments, that disagreement doesn't actually lead to the disaster it once quietly predicted. Go back to him for a second, sitting alone in that same parking lot from earlier. Picture the exact same scene, only now, several months later, everything's slightly different beneath the surface. Someone asks him for another favor, at another genuinely inconvenient time in his week. This time, there's a pause before he answers, small but noticeable if you know what to look for. Not a cold pause and not a punishing one either, just a pause, long enough for him to actually check in with himself before giving any answer at all. He still says yes sometimes, because sometimes yes is still the honest answer. But now it's a decision he's actually making, not a reflex firing on its own. And other times, for the first time in a very long while, he says something else instead of yes. He says he can't this time, simply and plainly, without over-explaining himself. Nothing collapses when he finally says it out loud, plainly, without apologizing 3 times first. No one disappears from his life because of it. The moment simply passes, the way most moments eventually do, and life continues on almost exactly as it was before. That's the quiet, undramatic proof his nervous system apparently needed all along, repeated enough times to finally start believing it. He looks at that same parking lot now and feels something noticeably different settle in his chest. Not relief exactly, though relief is certainly part of it. Something steadier than relief. Something with more weight and more permanence to it. Something closer to permission, the kind he had to quietly give himself, because no one else was ever going to hand that permission to him on their own. If any part of this felt familiar while you were watching, if you noticed yourself somewhere in the meeting, the phone call, or that parking lot, tell me. I'd genuinely love to know which single moment stayed with you the longest. Sometimes just naming that moment out loud, even to a stranger, becomes its own small pause worth having. And maybe, somewhere out there, someone else needs to hear that they're not the only one who freezes when they're finally asked what they actually want. There's more to sit with together in the next conversation, whenever you're ready to keep going with it.